Alright, settle in. Let the blankets wrap around you like a soft cocoon, and let's take a little trip. Not far, just across time. Tonight we drift gently across the misty waters of ancient Lake Texcoco. Your bed is now a slow-moving canoe, the mattress a gently rocking reed raft. Your hands brush the surface of the lake, dark and glassy, disturbed only by the paddle strokes of a passing farmer in a wide straw hat. A heron flaps away lazily. The air smells of damp earth and crushed marigold, and somewhere in the distance, a flute plays a minor, sleepy tune. You're in the heart of what will one day be known as Mexico City, but tonight, it's still the floating agricultural marvel of the Mexica, what we now call the Aztecs. You won't find castles here, no moats or dungeons, just a web of man-made islands that seem to hover like lilapads, even though they're built from stubborn mud and careful math. These are chinampas, floating gardens that somehow never float away. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing who's still awake out there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You awaken early, but not groggily, just that kind of alert where your dreams and reality are still negotiating. You're tucked in a reed hut, your bed raised just above the waterline. The walls are damp but not unpleasant. It's quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood and the distant squawk of a bird debating territorial rights. As you step out, the world is hushed in early morning fog. You wobble slightly on the floating path, a garden bed 3 canoes wide, framed with willows and edged with flowering bean vines. Everything here is green and glistening. A man paddles past with a load of lakebed mud stacked neatly like cakes. You watch him dock near a garden plot and start spreading the muck like frosting on top of decaying vegetation. The smell is not exactly lavender, but it's earthy and somehow reassuring. You learn quickly, these chinampas aren't technically floating, despite the nickname. They're anchored to the shallow lakebed using willow stakes. Layers of mud, algae, and compost create a raised bed rich enough to grow crops faster than you can say, pre-Hispanic organic farming. Historians still argue whether this was the Aztecs' invention or if earlier cultures like the Zacamilca beat them to it, but the Aztecs definitely scaled it to an empire-wide buffet. Everything is done with intention. The canals between plots aren't random. They're the roads, the irrigation, the emergency escape routes, and the scenic detours all at once. Imagine if Venice had a baby with a greenhouse and then handed it to a math nerd. You crouch to touch the soil. It's spongy but firm, alive with the roots of maize, beans, and squash. The 3 sisters, as they're sometimes called, keep each other company underground. Corn gives the beans a stalk to climb, beans fix nitrogen into the soil, and squash shades the ground to prevent weeds. It's basically a plant group chat, supportive, low drama, and extremely nourishing. Then you hear a rustle. A woman, elderly but strong-looking, walks barefoot along the chinampa edge, her arms full of tools. She nods in greeting and goes to check on her crop of sampasicil, bright orange marigolds used in ceremonies. You try not to step on her beetles, a fringe detail most history books skip. Aztec farmers used woven mats called petlatl to kneel on while tending their plots, to avoid sinking into the muck or offending any earth deities by squishing too many worms. You sit on one now, letting your fingertips trail through cool stalks of amaranth, wondering if you've already inhaled your monthly protein intake just from the pollen. The air hums with stillness. A frog somewhere plops back into the water. The willows around you weep gently, probably from pride. This land, if you can call it that, produces up to 7 harvests a year. Compare that to your basil plant back home that died after 3 Instagram stories. The chinampas are hyper-efficient, strangely elegant, and built entirely by hand. You sit there, legs folded, a little mosquito buzzing nearby like it owns the place. The water's so still that a passing canoe leaves ripples that seem to last forever. It's here, floating somewhere between engineering and dreamscape, that the Aztecs sustained a population of nearly 250,000 people. In a city with no wheels, no horses, no metal tools, just obsidian, brain power, and sheer collective stubbornness. And oh yes, dung. Lots of dung. Crocodile dung, actually, though not in the garden. That was more of a skincare thing. You'll hear more about that later. Sleep tight. You're still on your knees in the damp soil, watching that farmer spread lakebed mud like it's icing on an enormous cake made of twigs and compost. The chinampa smells faintly of rotting vegetation, but in a good way, like a forest after rain or a salad that knows it's contributing to something bigger than itself. The basic idea is simple. Dig up nutrient-rich sludge from the bottom of the lake, stack it with aquatic weeds, reeds, and bits of organic refuse, and shape it into a long, narrow plot raised just above water level. But the execution, that's where the genius shows. You walk the edge of the chinampa, careful not to slip. Each plot is edged with ahujo trees, tall willows that stabilize the soil with their roots and offer shade during the brutal dry season. Their drooping leaves hang over the canal like sleepy eyebrows. Ducks drift by beneath them, entirely unbothered by your presence. A man nearby in a canoe scoops handfuls of tecutlitl, a kind of green lake algae, and tosses it over the soil like it's parmesan. Turns out this scum is packed with protein and minerals. The Aztecs harvested it in large sheets, dried it, and ate it with tortillas. Historians still argue whether it was a staple or a famine fallback, but either way, you now know lake slime was on the menu. The plots themselves are built in neat, rectangular grids that extend for miles across the valley. Some are as long as a football field, though most are more modest. You step onto a narrower one and find a small shrine nestled at the end. Just a pile of rocks, shells, and feathers, but it radiates reverence. A local deity, no doubt. One of the quieter ones. Perhaps it watches over squash or the compost pile. You give a polite nod, just in case. As you sit again, cross-legged on a petlattle mat, you notice the silence. There's no sound of hammering, no engines. Only the occasional thwack of a paddle against the water, a faint splash, and the chirping of birds who think they own the place. You breathe it in, peace, pollen, and probably a few microbes that'll do wonders for your gut. There's a certain rhythm here, a meditative repetition. Scoop the mud, layer it, pat it down. It takes weeks to build a new chinampa, but once it's done, it's fertile for generations. You pass one where an elderly woman is coaxing bean tendrils to climb up maize stalks like little green mountaineers. She hums a song that drifts across the water and mingles with the mist. Fun fact, some chinampas were built in spiral patterns or ringed with flowers, not just for looks, but to guide insects and birds into doing their pollination rounds. And maybe, just maybe, because they liked a little artistic flair with their food security. You wander to the edge of another plot and peer into the water. Tiny fish dart among the reeds. A dragonfly hovers, then zips off like it remembered something urgent. A child paddles past in a canoe the size of a bathtub, grinning proudly. He's delivering squash blossoms to his grandmother. You wave. He nods like a tiny businessman and keeps going. The air is warm now. The mist is burning off, and the sun paints the lake in long bands of gold and green. You squint toward the horizon and realize this goes on for miles. It's not just a couple of farms. It's a vast agricultural web feeding the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. And they did it all without wheels, or cows, or iron tools, just sharp obsidian, clever planning, and years of trial and error. Modern engineers still study this system and whisper things like sustainable genius under their breath. Meanwhile, you sit cross-legged on ancient compost, hoping that frog doesn't jump into your lap again. As the wind picks up slightly, the willow branches sway, creating a hush like a giant lullaby. You lean back on your elbows, toes brushing the water. A passing boat carries bundles of herbs, epazote, hoja santa, mint, tied with thin fibers. One bundle slips off and floats toward you. You pluck it from the water. It smells like someone's great-grandmother's soup. Here's a quirky tidbit for your dreams tonight. Some chinampa plots had little shrines built specifically for mole. Not the animal, the sauce. Mole was sacred, complex, and apparently worth divine protection. Imagine building a tiny temple for gravy. The Aztecs didn't just farm food, they farmed memory, culture, and flavor. Above, a bird lets out a hoarse squawk, unimpressed with your poetic mood. A cloud drifts across the sun. You close your eyes and drift with it. Your eyes flutter open to a distant rhythm. Plop, plop, rustle, splash. Morning has shifted into late-day hum, and the chinampas are in full swing. Farmers move methodically along the narrow plots, bending, digging, bundling, paddling, humming. No tractors, no shouting, no coffee-fueled urgency. Just the hypnotic beat of sustenance. You step into a canoe offered by a cheerful young man who smells like sun and tomatoes. He motions you in with a nod and begins paddling lazily through the canal. The water is calm, reflecting the willows like a watercolor painting someone forgot to finish. On either side of you, chinampas stretch like patchwork quilts, each with its own blend of crops, flowers, and the occasional lounging dog. He points to one of the larger beds. Rows of plants are arranged in precise harmony. Maize, amaranth, beans, chili peppers, and even tomatillos, their little green husks rattling like maracas in the breeze. This is no random salad, this is empire cuisine. You lean over the side of the boat as he scoops a handful of water and tosses it onto the plot. Not irrigation in the way you're used to, just a refresh, a nod of thanks. These plants are pampered. They live better than most office workers. You reach out and touch a stalk of corn as the boat glides by. Feels warm, alive, confident. Did you know amaranth was once sacred? The Aztecs used it not only as a grain but also to sculpt effigies of their gods, then ceremonially consumed them. Yes, they literally ate their deities. Historians still argue whether that was symbolic or practical, or maybe just a really dramatic potluck. You arrive at a chinampa tended by a woman with bright woven ribbons in her braids. She smiles, then beckons you to step off the canoe and onto the soil. You wobble slightly. It's spongy, springy, and unexpectedly welcoming. She hands you a curved digging stick and gestures toward a cluster of squash plants. You bend, dig gently, and unearth a plump, speckled fruit. It smells like sunshine. You try not to let your clumsy foreign fingers offend the soil spirits. As you help her bundle the harvest, she explains with a few words and many gestures that everything grown here feeds someone nearby. There's no export model, no stockpile, no abstract economy. Food moves from chinampa to canoe to market to mouth, sometimes all in one day. The system is as local as it gets. Hyperlocal, really. You could shout your grocery list across the canal and have it delivered by paddle within the hour. Some plots grow herbs, epazote, avocado leaves, chaya, even something that smells suspiciously like cilantro but goes by a name you can't quite pronounce. Others are floral, rows of sympathicil, dahlias, red geraniums, and the rare xochitl flowers for offerings, medicine, and personal decoration. You watch as a young girl weaves a crown from violet petals and sticks her tongue out at her brother who wants one too. And then, surprise twist, you pass a chinampa growing nothing but moss and ferns. It looks like a tiny forest got lost on its way to the mountain. The woman shrugs and tells you it's for rituals. No explanation, no details. You don't ask further. The moss seems to be watching. You climb back into the canoe and continue through the lazy zigzag of canals. The boat drifts near a floating coop. Chickens cluck and blink, clearly used to tourists. Further down, a man tosses feed to a small herd of ducks, who honk politely and begin their leisurely dinner. The Aztecs knew protein was essential, and chinampas offered more than just veggies. They supported animals, insects, and even frogs, some of which, yes, were edible. You pause as the wind shifts slightly, bringing a new scent, warm, nutty, and sweet. You glance ahead and find another boat drifting toward you with bundles of roasted chili-laced maize cakes. Tlaxcali, the great-grandparent of modern tortillas. A woman aboard smiles and hands you one. It's still warm. You take a bite. It's perfect. Here's your quirky tidbit of the hour. Some elite chinampas even grew cacao trees, though they needed extra care and shelter from wind. Imagine a floating garden that grows chocolate. Now try not to be jealous of a 15th century priest who got to drink it daily, frothy and spiced. The boat slows. The sun dips. A heron flaps overhead. And you, half snoozing, are now full of corn, lake breeze, and probably mosquito bites that are culturally significant. The sun now hovers just above the lake, stretching shadows long across the water like soft ribbons. Your canoe glides lazily through a narrow canal. On either side, the chinampas shimmer with the golden hue of late afternoon. It's the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting. If the painting had ducks in the margins and someone humming off-key nearby, you steer toward a small settlement where homes seem to hover just inches above the lake. These aren't palaces. Just modest, reed-walled huts with thatched roofs and wooden steps dipping straight into the water. One has laundry flapping in the breeze. Another hosts a dog who clearly thinks he owns the lake. A child leans over the edge of a platform, dangling a string into the water with something suspiciously bread-like tied at the end. You've arrived at a chinampa neighborhood. Life here is intimately tied to the water, in every way that matters. You're greeted by a woman who waves you in and gestures to an empty spot on a bench carved from old tree root. She's boiling something over a fire pit balanced on damp stone slabs. The smell? Smoky, spicy, possibly involving squash. You smile, sit, and try not to fall in. Children scurry about. One carries a tiny basket of herbs. Another is chasing a duck, who is 100% not interested in being caught. Nearby, an older man repairs a net with fingers so fast they blur. Life here isn't fast-paced, but it's full. People live almost entirely off what the Chinampas provide. You begin to see how a lakebed became a city. The woman offers you a bowl of stew, quolites, a mix of wild greens, spiced with epazote and flecked with amaranth seeds. It's warm, hearty, and far better than whatever protein bar you were planning to eat in 2025. You take a second helping. She doesn't ask, she just smiles. Here's a mainstream fact to chew on. Mexico City's modern population still owes a debt to Chinampa agriculture. During the peak of the Aztec Empire, the system fed over 200,000 people with shocking efficiency. And it wasn't just food. There were floating areas for laundry, for bathing, even for religious ceremonies. It was a city on water before Venice ever thought it was cool. The canoe driver from earlier now lounges nearby, eating tamales wrapped in corn husks. You accept one. It's filled with squash blossoms and duck meat, seasoned just enough to make your lips tingle. Fun fact, the Aztecs domesticated Muscovy ducks, the only major civilization in the Americas to do so. You glance at the duck the child was chasing earlier and realize you've probably just met its cousin. As the meal wraps up, music starts somewhere in the distance. It's not loud, just the soft thrum of a drum, a flute weaving between the beats like mist. A few people dance, nothing formal, just swaying and laughing. A toddler spins in a circle until she falls, giggling. You're invited to help prepare the night lamps, small ceramic bowls filled with fat and a single reed as a wick. One by one, they're lit and floated out into the water. The flames flicker, mirrored in the surface, creating the illusion of stars beneath your feet. You ask about the floating pens nearby. Someone tells you they keep not just ducks and chickens, but also small dogs, Zoloid squintly, the hairless breed with a face only a sleep-deprived historian could love. They're sacred, they say, companions for life and afterlife. You nod solemnly at a little one chewing on a sandal. A scholarly debate flits into your drowsy brain. Historians still argue whether Chinampa homes were meant to be fully permanent or semi-seasonal. Some believe families rotated between urban centers and their garden homes. Others say entire extended families lived on the Chinampas year-round, raising children, animals, and, occasionally, eyebrow-raising quantities of chili. You stretch your legs and dangle your feet over the edge of the platform. The water is warm, and the fireflies have begun their show. Overhead, stars emerge, one by one, shyly at first. A crescent moon hangs low, reflected in the still lake like a silver canoe of its own. In the distance, laughter echoes over the water. Someone has set off a tiny firework, a puff of red that startles a bird into flight. The children cheer. You smile, head heavy with tamale and starlight, and lay back onto a woven mat. The sounds of the Chinampa night are gentle but layered. The splash of a paddle, a baby crying then soothed, the faint hum of a flute. Somewhere a frog offers commentary. And just as your eyes begin to close again, a woman tiptoes past with a clay jar of lake water. She pours a thin stream onto the edge of the plot, murmuring something to herself. A blessing, maybe, or a recipe. Either way, the soil seems to listen. You wake not with a start, but with the lazy awareness of someone who's halfway between dream and lake mist. The Chinampa night has drifted into early morning again, this time wrapped in dew and incense. You're not alone. A quiet gathering has formed near a crooked willow tree at the end of the plot. Figures move slowly, barefoot, heads bowed. You recognize a few from last night. The tamale woman, the net mender, the duck chaser. Though now they're all different, somehow quieter, softer. You rise, stretch, and follow. The sun isn't up yet, but the horizon glows pink and purple. At the center of the clearing sits a simple shrine, smooth stones arranged in a spiral, decorated with feathers, seeds, tiny clay bowls, and wilted marigolds. It smells like burnt copal and damp earth. A man steps forward holding a bundle of reeds. He dips them into a ceramic bowl filled with water, lake water, probably, and sprinkles it across the soil. He mutters something under his breath, a chant or maybe a joke with the gods. Then the others follow, each bringing something. A chili pepper, a dollop of honey, a carved bead, a single cacao bean. You hesitate, then you dig into your sash, pull out the last squash blossom from your pocket, and gently place it on the altar. Welcome to the ritual of Tlaloc, the Aztec rain god. Yes, the same one you heard about in school, but without the over-the-top human sacrifice angle. What you're witnessing is something more everyday, more neighborly. Historians still argue whether these local rituals were truly sanctioned by the state priesthood or just tolerated folk customs. But to the people here, it doesn't matter. Tlaloc is real. The rain is real. and the Chinampas thrive only with both. The man raises a clay cup and pours a stream of water onto the altar stone. The liquid trickles down into the soil. Someone whispers, "For the next planting." Another adds, "For the frogs." You think about the frogs too. They've been loud enough to earn their own tribute. This isn't a show. There are no drums, no sacrifices, no masks. Just a group of sleepy people giving thanks before the day begins. Feels intimate, like saying grace with your entire lake. Suddenly, a child sneezes and breaks the silence. Everyone chuckles. The spell breaks gently, and the crowd disperses. A few people return to their chores. Others paddle away. One young man slaps a mosquito with priestly dignity. You're invited to help clean the altar area. As you sweep away petals and ash, an elder tells you about the symbolism of the lake. It's not just water. It's the womb of the earth, the mirror of the sky, the bridge to the gods. You nod solemnly. The frog by your foot also seems impressed. Later that morning, you follow another small group heading toward a shrine farther down the canal, this one far more decorated, with colorful fabrics, intricate carvings, and offerings of maize dough shaped like tiny ducks. This, you're told, is for Calcayatlacu, goddess of lakes and streams. Her name means she of the jade skirt, and she's considered both a life-giver and, occasionally, a mood-swinging destroyer of entire villages. You decide to be respectful. A woman lights a bundle of herbs and waves the smoke over your body. She says it's for cleansing, but it smells suspiciously like marinated fish. You try not to sneeze. She smiles anyway. Here's your fringe fact for this float. During certain festivals, Aztec priests would craft tiny floating islands just for the gods, made of flowers and feathers and incense. They would drift them into the lake as spiritual messages, like floating prayer texts. It's believed some were even set alight in moonlit ceremonies. Divine mail with a wax seal and everything. Back on your own canoe, you drift under an arch of drooping vines. The water is glass smooth again, reflecting the rising sun like liquid gold. You spot a group of children tossing flower petals onto the lake, watching to see which ones sink and which ones drift. They argue over what it means. One claims it predicts the rain. Another says it's who'll win the next canoe race. A girl just shrugs and eats a petal. It's all sacred, in a way. You pass another family carefully adding duck eggs to a shallow pen built along their Chinampa edge. The birds honk softly, indifferent. A boy tells you they believe dreams can travel through water, so they place eggs where the ripples are calmest, so the baby ducks will hatch without bad omens. He's 10 years old and already understands more cosmic symbolism than your last yoga instructor. You glance at the lake again, stretching out around you like an ancient mirror, and wonder how many dreams are tucked beneath its surface. How many were planted alongside the maize and chili? How many were whispered into the reeds and carried by frogs to the gods above? You lean back in your canoe. Somewhere far off, the morning drums of Tenochtitlan begin to thrum. But here, in the slow heartbeat of the Chinampas, you remain, adrift in mud, myth, and something that feels very much like peace. You're drifting again, but this time not from sleep. You're drifting through a canal that's narrower, murkier, and strangely quiet. The laughter of children and the rhythm of farm work have faded behind you. Here, the Chinampas are wilder, less tended. The flowers lean over the water like old women listening to secrets. You hear a splash, then silence, then another splash. You're not alone. Up ahead, two boys crouch behind a wall of sunflowers. One gestures wildly while the other adjusts something on the Chinampa edge. You float closer. Suddenly, one of them leaps up, grabs a stick, and jabs it downward into the water. A startled squawk erupts, followed by furious splashing. You squint and realize they've just chased off a rival from another Chinampa. He paddles away sulkily, waving a half-eaten tamale in surrender. Welcome to Chinampa warfare, the flower-covered, mud-flinging battlefield of the Aztec Empire. It's less Game of Thrones and more mildly passive-aggressive territorial tussles, but no less strategic. You ease your canoe closer to a group of adults now gathering around the scene. One of them grins and points to a cluster of marigolds planted in a dense wall. These aren't here for beauty. They're a floral fence, planted thickly to hide movements, mark territory, and even confuse the enemy during surprise raids. That's right. Even in paradise, there's drama. Historians still argue whether Chinampa skirmishes were officially sanctioned or just highly localized turf wars. But the records agree on one thing. Chinampas weren't just farms, they were tactical zones. During larger conflicts, they became buffers, traps, and even battlegrounds. Want to defend your floating empire? Try camouflaging a mud trench with squash leaves. One elder chuckles and shows you how, back in his youth, they would coat the edges of their chinampas in slippery algae, just enough to make an invading canoe tip. Not deadly, just embarrassing, and very, very green. You pass another plot now fortified with sharpened stakes hidden among the water hyacinth. Harmless to fish, devastating to overconfident paddler. Someone nearby mutters, "You didn't hear this from me, but last year a marriage proposal went south because of one of these." You're not sure if he means metaphorically or literally. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some chinampa owners trained aggressive ducks to act as noise alarms. Anyone stepping onto the plot at night risked triggering a flurry of indignant honks that could wake half the lake. Security system, Aztec edition. You're invited to watch a demonstration. A young man lays out a mock raid across the neighboring plot. Two boys in canoes try to sneak across the canal using lily pads as cover. They're ambushed by flower-throwing girls from behind a pile of compost. It's unclear who wins, but everyone ends up soaked, giggling, and slightly flower-scented. You wipe a marigold petal from your shoulder. Somewhere nearby, a drum beats, a slow, steady rhythm. Not ceremonial, more like a signal. A woman with a knowing look paddles past, raising her eyebrow. "Fishing contest," she says, "and maybe revenge." You follow the sound to a wider canal, where a crowd has gathered, festive but tense. Two older men stand at opposite ends of a long, narrow chinampa. Each holds a paddle, a fishing net, and the unmistakable air of someone who hasn't forgiven a joke from last harvest. They're not just fishing, they're competing for honor, pride, and probably first pick of the tamales later. The crowd cheers. The contest begins. They paddle, scoop, paddle, sling mud. One almost falls. The other flings a fish dramatically into the air. The children go wild. The frogs flee. You feel oddly invested. In the end, it's declared a tie, mainly because one of the judges is married to both competitors' sisters. Peace is restored with bowls of roasted corn, and the smell of warm tortillas returns to the air. You sit on the edge of a nearby plot, feet dangling over the water, still damp from the floral ambush. It hits you that even in conflict, the chinampa way is playful, strategic, yes, but also human, messy, muddy, more like a family feud than a battlefield. And that's the thing. The Aztecs weren't all towering pyramids and ceremonial knives. They were also pranksters, planners, and plant nerds who made a swamp into a metropolis and still found time to weaponize petunias. You lie back and stare at the sky, marigold stuck in your hair, wondering if maybe, just maybe, we're underestimating how fun ancient sustainability could be. The laughter and commotion of the fishing contest fade behind you as you once again take to the canals. Your paddle dips softly into the water, sending sleepy ripples across the glassy surface. The chinampas grow busier up ahead. Smoke curls from cooking fires. The hum of conversation floats lazily on the breeze, and you hear the faint bleating of a goat who sounds positively offended about something. You're not headed to a farm this time. You're gliding into the heart of something bigger. You round a bend and it stretches out before you, Tlatelolco Market. Well, at least the lakeside fringe of it, the floating edge. Dozens of canoes are moored in makeshift docks, stacked with goods, clay pots, maize, chilies, obsidian blades, cacao beans, carved toys, woven blankets, and enough spices to rewire your brain. Even at the chinampa level, this place is huge. You step out of your canoe and onto a series of wooden platforms lashed together, forming floating walkways that bounce gently beneath your feet. You nearly trip over a turkey. It glares at you like it's seen things. And here's your mainstream fact. Tlatelolco was the largest market in the Aztec world. Estimates say over 60,000 people visited it on major trading days. A full-blown economic metropolis. Cortez himself, who could find a conspiracy in a tortilla, was so impressed he supposedly admitted it rivaled anything in Europe. But let's zoom in, because today you're not browsing from an imperial throne, you're hungry, barefoot, and definitely about to spend way too many cacao beans on snacks. You pass a canoe piled with salamander soup. Yes, real salamanders, grilled and bobbing gently in broth. The seller claims it boosts strength and clears the mind. You pass politely but pocket the recipe in your imagination. A boy tugs your sleeve and offers a miniature jaguar figurine carved from volcanic rock. You trade a small handful of amaranth for it, and he beams like you've just handed him the moon. Moments later, someone tries to sell you a knife shaped like a banana. You decline, mostly out of fear. You catch sight of something that smells divine. A woman tending to a canoe oven. Yes, that's a thing. roasting maize cake stuffed with roasted squash seeds, episode, and a touch of honey. She hands you one wrapped in banana leaf. You take a bite and question every meal you've ever had. As you wander deeper into the market, the goods get stranger. A man hawks what look like dried beetles mixed with chili powder, and you realize, ah yes, ancient trail mix. Another has cotton dyed with crushed cochineal bugs, the red so intense it practically hums. And then you find the spice section, long trays of dried chili peppers, vanilla pods, smoked cocoa, dried flowers, and something called fire tongue powder. It smells like a sneeze waiting to happen. You buy some, of course. Quirky tidbit of the day. Some Chinampa farmers in this region didn't just grow crops, they specialized in color. That's right. Entire floating plots were dedicated to dye plants, used to color textiles, paint murals, and occasionally dye small animals for festivals. Imagine floating up to a garden that smells like hibiscus and turns your tunic permanently magenta. Nearby, a group of older women sit cross-legged on woven mats, grinding something in metates, flat stones used for processing maize. They hum as they work. You pause to watch the smooth, rhythmic motion, the gentle shh of stone on stone, and realize this is the background music of an empire. Suddenly, a loud voice rings out. A man on a raised platform, wrapped in embroidered cloth, declares the arrival of a new shipment from the coast. A cheer erupts. Within minutes, people are crowding around to grab dried shrimp, sea salt, and smoked fish wrapped in palm fronds. You manage to snag a packet of seaweed that smells like you've just walked into a very polite titipool. Historians still debate whether this trade was managed by strict laws or left to market flow. Some say each product had its place, its tax, and its enforcers. Others argue the system was more fluid, based on relationships, gossip, and the occasional bribe of chili paste. Likely, a bit of both. And don't forget the gossip. You pause at a corner where 3 elderly men sip cacao drinks thickened with corn and flavored with chili and honey. They gesture for you to sit. You do. One offers a cup. The spicy, frothy, slightly gritty, surprisingly addictive. They chat in slow, drawling Nahuatl, occasionally laughing. One nudges you and says, "That man over there? He once tried to sell painted pebbles as healing beans." You glance. The man in question smiles and waves proudly. The sun hangs high now. The market buzzes with life. You're full of squash cakes, cacao, and information you'll never use in a modern grocery store. You climb into your canoe once more, heavier than before, in knowledge, in carbs, and in an uncomfortable awareness that you might be slightly addicted to spicy chocolate. As you drift away from the market, you glance back at the floating maze of trade, color, and shouting. And for a moment you wonder, what would happen if your local farmer's market also had ducks, obsidian, and 5 different types of beetle jerky? It would probably sink. But here, it floats beautifully. You drift away from the market still chewing something spicy and mysterious, possibly made of insects and dreams. The canal narrows again, winding back into the heart of the Chinampa network where the world softens. Less shouting, more birdsong. Less commerce, more community. Your canoe bumps gently against the side of another floating plot, but this one feels different. The air is quieter, focused, intentional. You hear the rustling of leaves, the faint murmur of voices reciting something melodic. As you step off, you realize you've entered a floating school. Yes, a school, but not the kind with bells and pop quizzes. This is an Aztec telpacali, an education space for youth, specifically boys of commoner families, but out here, away from the bustle of Tenochtitlan, it blends with Chinampa life in a gentle, poetic way. You sit cross-legged at the edge of the plot, watching a small group of children and their instructor perched on woven mats beneath a willow tree. The lesson? Astronomy through poetry. The teacher points skyward, then down to the water, then quotes a line that translates roughly to, "The stars teach the maize to grow." The children nod. One falls asleep upright. No one blames him. Mainstream fact for your mind to snack on. Aztec education was mandatory for both boys and girls, making it one of the most literate civilizations of its time. Girls studied at home or in designated Kalmukak schools, often learning midwifery, weaving, or ritual songs. Boys, depending on class, were trained for farming, priesthood, or war, but always with a dose of poetry and philosophy. One boy near you is sketching on a bark paper codex with a bit of charcoal. You glance over. It's a flower with a spiral stem and stars for petals. He tells you it's what dreams look like when they bloom underwater. You nod like you understand, because somehow you do. The teacher moves to a different mat and begins explaining the calendar system. a blend of 260-day ritual cycles and 365-day solar rhythms. He draws symbols into the soil, circles, eyes, dots. The kids copy them with sticks. It looks like math, but feels like music. You look around and realize the Chinampa itself has been turned into a classroom. There's a section for botany, children gently touching leaves, learning which ones cure fevers and which ones will make you talk to invisible frogs. Another area holds clay figures arranged in rows. History class, maybe, or sculpture, or both. A girl walks by balancing a jug on her head, reciting something under her breath. You catch a few words about maize, sky, and wind. You ask what she's doing. She says she's practicing a harvest blessing for tomorrow's offering. Then she offers you a fig and skips away. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Chinampa communities, learning wasn't confined to age or formality. Grandmothers taught constellations while making tamales. Uncles taught geometry while patching canoes. Even fishing was a lesson in ecology and patience. Knowledge floated from one person to the next like pollen, light, persistent, and impossible to keep in one place. Nearby, two boys argue gently about whether frogs can predict rain. One swears he heard a frog croak 3 times before a storm. The other insists it was a duck pretending to be a frog. A girl listening in solves it by saying, "Frogs and ducks are cousins. They talk about the weather together." No one argues with that. You stroll to the edge of the Chinampa and find a small shelter, its walls woven from reeds, its floor layered with mats and feathers. Inside, a woman teaches 2 children how to paint symbols using natural dyes. Reds from cochineal, blues from crushed flowers, blacks from charred wood. The brushes are just fine reeds, chewed on one end. One child paints a maize stalk. The other paints a jaguar with a spiral tail. You paint a fish. It looks like a nervous cucumber. They politely call it dreamfish. Historians still debate how much formal structure these rural schools had. Some argue they were extensions of the temple system. Others believe they were informal, led by elders and parents based on need and season. But most agree that Chinampa communities pass down complex knowledge, astronomy, agriculture, oral tradition without walls or certificate. The sun begins to dip, painting the canal in gold again. The class begins a group recitation, a rhythmic chant honoring water, soil, and the plants that grow from their love. You join in on the easy parts, mumbling your way through words you don't know but feel. Everyone giggles at the boy who sneezes mid-verse. As the lesson ends, the teacher thanks the children. He bows not just to them, but to the Chinampa, the canal, the trees, even the frogs. The kids mimic him with exaggerated seriousness. One bows so low he topples into the water. Laughter, soggy pride. You return to your canoe, paddle resting in your lap. You watch the school fade into the distance, just another floating garden, until you notice the painted stones, the whispering children, the poetry drifting on the air. You were never just floating. You were learning to listen. You drift once more, belly full of knowledge, paint smudged on your fingers, and maybe a little fig juice on your sleeve. The sky is now streaked with the deep oranges and purples of early dusk, and your canoe coasts slowly through canals that smell faintly of wood smoke and something delightfully savory. A man waves you in from a neighboring Chinampa, beckoning you with a wooden ladle. You obey, mostly because his canoe has a clay oven strapped to it, and you've learned not to argue with anyone who cooks while floating. He's a Chinampa chef, a master of water-based cuisine. His apron is woven, stained with chili and squash, and his mustache looks like it's been singed more than once. He says nothing, just gestures for you to sit and hands you a bowl of something warm, spicy, and suspiciously green. You take a bite. It's a tamale stuffed with duck and pumpkin blossoms, seasoned with garlic, amaranth seed, and what might be some kind of citrusy lake herb. You pause mid-chew. He nods in approval. It's as if the entire season has collapsed into one steaming bite. Let's talk about Aztec cuisine, because if you thought this empire ran on maize and sacrifice, you've seriously underestimated the palate. Mainstream fact: the Aztec diet was astonishingly diverse and rich in plant-based proteins. Chinampas alone could grow beans, maize, squash, chili peppers, tomatoes, chia, amaranth, and dozens of herbs, not to mention edible flowers, insects, and freshwater creatures. And everything had its place. Food wasn't just for sustenance, it was a form of ritual, medicine, and even diplomacy. Tonight's menu includes tamales wrapped in corn husks, stewed nopales, cactus paddles, with oniony wild garlic, and a bowl of chili-spiked cocoa so thick you could paint a canoe with it. The chef makes it with roasted cacao paste, honey, and dried chili, then froths it using a carved wooden whisk called a malanillo. He spins it with practiced rhythm, and the bubbles form a perfect spiral. You sip, as heat, smoke, and starlight in a cup. A girl passes by offering toasted grasshoppers with lime and salt. You flinch. She shrugs, pops one in her mouth, and wanders off, leaving you reconsidering your stance on crunchy protein. Here's your quirky tidbit for the evening. Some Chinampa chefs believed that singing to their food improved its flavor. Not scientifically proven, but several dishes you try tonight are accompanied by gentle humming, and honestly, they do taste like lullabies. As the night deepens, others arrive. Canoes drift up carrying extended family members, elders, kids, even a curious dog who's clearly irregular. Clay lanterns are lit and placed around the plot, glowing softly like sleeping fireflies. The Chinampa becomes an open-air restaurant, part dinner table, part floating dream. A boy begins roasting avocado leaves over hot coals. They release a scent that's somewhere between basil, anise, and divine intervention. The leaves will be used to wrap fish caught from the lake, which are then slow-cooked beside stones until the meat flakes apart like mist. You find a seat on a woven mat next to an older woman who pours you a cup of atole, a warm drink made from corn masa, vanilla, and cinnamon. She tells you her recipe came from her grandmother, who got it from her grandmother, who learned it from a frog. You nod because at this point that feels entirely reasonable. Historians still argue whether these recipes were standardized or purely regional. Some evidence points to detailed food knowledge being passed down orally, while others suggest glyph-based recipe codes hidden in painted codices. What's certain is that the Aztecs were obsessive about balance, hot and cold foods, wet and dry, body and spirit. You're handed a small clay plate holding tlacoyos, thick corn cakes stuffed with beans and sprinkled with edible flowers. One has squash blossom petals arranged in the shape of a sun. It's art. You eat it anyway. As the evening quiets, you hear laughter drift in from another Chinampa, a joke about someone who tried to ferment chili and ended up creating a weapon instead. A small flute begins to play, slow and soft, weaving between the lanterns like a ribbon. Then, the chef announces the final course: roasted amaranth honey cakes, shaped like the moon, dusted with crushed cocoa nibs. You take a bite. Your jaw melts. You thank the gods of harvest, ducks, and flavor profiles. The night is still, save for the occasional flick of a paddle or someone scraping the last bit of stew from their bowl. You lean back on a soft mat, head spinning. Not from wine, there is none, but from taste, scent, and story. Someone wraps a blanket around your shoulders. You glance at the stars above and the water below, and you realize the Chinampas didn't just feed the body. They nourished the soul. With tamales, yes, but also with laughter, ceremony, and the gentle clink of clay cups shared under moonlight. You close your eyes. Full, safe, home. You wake to birdsong and the faint, peppery scent of roasting chilies. But something else is in the air: curiosity. A farmer crouches beside you, gesturing for you to follow him. He carries a bundle of husks under one arm and a long walking stick with a carved jaguar at its top. His Chinampa is quiet but charged. You stumble along behind him, rubbing your eyes. He leads you toward a series of neat, low plots bordered with small, colorful banners. A cluster of children and elders are already gathered, murmuring in excitement around something that looks, at first glance, like an ordinary corn stalk. Except, it's white, stark white. No yellow, no blue, no red kernels. This is albino maize, glistening in the early sunlight like a ghost version of a taco ingredient. The farmer grins and plucks one ear from the stalk, turning it gently in his hands before handing it to a wide-eyed child, who cradles it like treasure. Very lucky, the farmer says, then pats the ground. Grew after the eclipse. You're witnessing a rare event, one that slips between science and folklore. The Aztecs cultivated many varieties of maize, and occasionally, through selective breeding or mysterious mutation, a white or near-translucent strain would appear. Whether by nature or nurture, these ears were considered sacred. Here's your mainstream fact to start the day. Maize wasn't just food, it was the cornerstone of Aztec identity. The god Sentiatl embodied it, festivals were held in its honor, and life cycles were described using corn metaphors. People were said to be born of maize. Your skin, your bones, your voice, all masa and magic. And this strange white corn, it was seen as a divine gift. Some believed it came when the gods were pleased. Others said it appeared during times of great change, or when someone nearby was destined for a new fate. You glance sideways. No pressure. Historians still argue whether this variety of corn was intentionally bred for rituals or simply a happy accident occasionally embraced by oral tradition. Either way, its appearance always stirred questions. Why here? Why now? Why this patch of soil? And what do you do with a divine vegetable? The answer, as it turns out, is make tamales. Of course, the elders begin preparing a ceremonial batch, mixing albino cornmeal with amaranth, honey, and squash blossom. One woman hums softly as she grinds the kernels with a flat stone, pausing only to offer a tiny pinch of dough to a small clay idol resting nearby. The idol wears a headdress of dried beans and seems unbothered. You're invited to help. The dough is warm in your hands, sticky with tradition. You clumsily wrap a tamale, trying to mimic the expert folds of the woman beside you. She smiles and fixes yours before slipping it into the steamer basket. This humbling, but not humiliating. While the tamales cook, the children begin playing a quiet game of Guess the God, drawing symbols in the dirt and offering clues like, he lives in the clouds and likes frogs, or, she cries during eclipses. You don't guess a single one right, but your performance as Tlaloc's lost cousin gets a small applause. Then comes your fringe tidbit of the hour. Some communities believed white maize held minor healing powers. Not enough to replace a doctor, but good for mending bad dreams, calming stomachs, or, oddly specific, helping goats give birth without complications. You file that one away just in case. The tamales are done. The smell is gentler than last night's, lighter, sweeter. You bite into one. The taste is soft, like a song you don't know but somehow remember. It melts into your thoughts. You sit back, full of divine carbs and myth, and listen as the farmer recounts how his grandfather once buried a single white corn kernel during a lunar eclipse and swore it whispered to him from underground. No one knows if it grew, but the story did. You look again at the remaining stalks. Some of them lean just slightly toward you. Coincidence? A boy tugs at your sleeve. He holds up another ear of the white corn and says solemnly, "You should take this." You hesitate. He shrugs. "Or eat it. The gods are flexible." You carefully wrap the ear in a piece of cloth and tuck it under your belt like a relic. As you rise to leave, a breeze carries a flurry of corn husks across the chinampa, like fluttering feathers. The farmer waves, and the children return to their lessons, their games, and probably more guesses about cloud-dwelling amphibians. You step into your canoe, the gift of albino maize warm against your hip, and push off slowly. The canal seems quieter now, or maybe just more reverent. You're not sure if you're different, but your lunch definitely is. The canoe glides once more into open water, this time veering through wider canals with more traffic. Paddlers pass you with bundles of flowers, baskets of squash, a crate of mildly irritated ducks, and even one man solemnly transporting what appears to be an enormous clay incense burner shaped like a turtle. You nod. He nods. No explanation needed. You're heading into the deeper parts of the Chinampa Empire now, no longer the quiet family plots or the side-channel schools. This is serious territory. Vast fields feeding not just local homes but entire armies and temples. You're entering the domain of imperial expansion. At the height of the Aztec Empire, especially during the reign of rulers like Moctezuma I, Chinampa agriculture wasn't just an innovation, it was a logistical marvel. The city of Tenochtitlan depended on it, and the state knew it. The construction of new Chinampas was state-coordinated, tax-managed, and often guarded by canal patrols. This wasn't just farming. This was infrastructure. You pass long stretches of perfectly aligned plots, each Chinampa wider, straighter, and more organized than the dreamy, curving gardens you saw earlier. These were built for scale, efficiency, and high-yield output. The crops here don't lean whimsically in the breeze. They stand at attention, like soldiers in green uniforms. Here's your mainstream fact. These imperial Chinampas were able to supply food to support hundreds of thousands of citizens, even during seasons of drought or war. The canal system allowed for rapid distribution. Canoes became delivery vehicles for corn, beans, squash, and chili, all loaded, launched, and logged with military precision. As you float by, you overhear a supervisor barking orders to a team of paddlers. He holds a clipboard, made of bark. The tone is clear: move the amaranth faster. The priests are waiting. But even here, amidst rows of uniform maize, a little personality sneaks in. A worker hums a love song to his pumpkins. Another stops to untangle a fish that's gotten itself lost in a pile of floating lilies. A woman plants a tiny cactus in the shape of a heart near her plot's edge. Resistance? Maybe. or just personal flair in a system of state-sponsored vegetables. You tie up your canoe beside a small rest station, just a shaded platform with woven benches and a clay pot of tamarind water. An elder greets you with a nod and pats the bench beside him. You sit. He begins to explain, without prompting, how the Aztec state used chinampas to secure loyalty from surrounding city-states. Farmers were rewarded for high yields. Nobles were granted special plots. Entire military units were provisioned through these floating fields. And those who resisted imperial taxation, their canals got rerouted. Or, as he puts it, the water remembers who paid their tribute. You sip the tamarind water. It's tart, sweet, and a little gritty, but it wakes you up. He continues, this time with a grin, telling you how one noble supposedly built a secret chinampa shaped like a jaguar's paw, claiming it would scare the crows into respect. Historians still argue whether this is true or just a very elaborate gardening myth. Either way, it's oddly compelling. You step away and explore one of the larger plots. The crops here are labeled with clay markers, each bearing a symbol for its owner, its season, and its yield goal. A group of teenagers work quickly, clearly well-trained. They move in near silence, passing buckets of compost, aligning stalks, and scooping lake muck into neat piles. It's farming as choreography. You notice a distinct absence of flowers here, just rows and rows of food. One boy sees your puzzled look and says, "Flowers are for poems. This land is for warriors." You nod. The corn nods back. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some warriors returning from battle were awarded their own chinampas as gifts, land on water, so to speak. These victory plots often grew chili peppers, believed to increase strength and spiritual power. Some even claimed chili-fueled warriors could see better at night. Historians remain skeptical, so do your taste buds. As you return to your canoe, you see an imperial canoe pass by, heavily laden with goods, salt from coastal cities, cacao from the south, and cotton cloth from tribute towns. It disappears into the canal network like a fish into a reef, bound for a palace or perhaps a temple. You lean back as your canoe drifts again, this time between rows of chinampas so long and orderly they begin to feel endless, like green roads stretching toward a city built on ambition. And that's what this is, isn't it? The chinampas aren't just gardens anymore. They're tools of empire, feeding rulers, sustaining armies, binding allies, punishing dissenters, and quietly reminding everyone that the gods may send the rain, but the state distributes the corn. Still, as the sun tilts low and casts golden stripes across the water, you hear a girl singing to a squash plant, soft, off-key, and entirely unconcerned with imperial logistics. You smile. Even empires, it seems, float best when rooted in songs. The sky darkens to a deep, indigo blue as you paddle slowly through a maze of quieter canals. Gone are the regimented imperial plots, the bark clipboard supervisors, and the urgency of state-sponsored farming. Here, the chinampas return to something older, something softer, a place of reflection. You drift into a long, narrow stretch of water flanked by chinampas that bloom with moonflowers, their petals glowing faintly in the twilight like porcelain lanterns. The air is rich with scent, floral, earthy, and just a bit sweet, like someone whispered honey into the soil. Fireflies blink lazily over the water's surface. Somewhere, a night heron calls out a single, echoing note. This is not farmland anymore. This is a ritual space. Your canoe slides gently into a small open cove surrounded by chinampas arranged in a circle. Each is dotted with clay lanterns, flower bundles, and obsidian bowls filled with unlit incense. At the center, a raised platform made of packed reeds and stone rises just above the lake's surface. A group of figures in simple robes stand in silence around it. You tie up your canoe and step quietly onto a nearby mat. No one speaks. A woman begins to sing, a low, trembling note that quivers like water under moonlight. It's not a melody, you know, but it holds you in place like a net. One by one, the others join in, men, women, children, even the old man you saw whittling squash seeds into whistles earlier. The song rises in gentle waves. It doesn't fill the air, it weaves through it. You are witnessing a nocturnal chinampa ritual, something few outsiders ever described in writing, and fewer still understood. It's not for war, not for harvest, not even for the gods in their towering pyramid. This is for the water, for the roots, for the memory beneath the mud. A girl walks to the center and places a bowl of floating candles into the lake. She lights them one by one. They drift outward, reflections doubling the stars above. Here's your mainstream fact. While many Aztec rituals were highly public, filled with color and ceremony, others, especially those in rural or semi-autonomous communities, were intimate, moonlit affairs meant to honor ancestors, lakes, or the spirit of place. These were rarely recorded, passed only through oral tradition and muscle memory. You close your eyes, letting the melody settle into your chest. It hums behind your ribs like a second heartbeat. Then, from one of the chinampas, a figure approaches carrying something wrapped in embroidered cloth. It's an offering, carefully prepared. Maize, beans, flowers, and what looks like a slice of cooked squash shaped into a spiral. It is laid at the edge of the platform. The woman bows her head. Others follow, each placing something meaningful: fruits, tools, feathers, even drawings. The breeze picks up, carrying the scent of burnt copal resin. The flames flicker, casting shadows that ripple across the water like ink spilled on silk. Somewhere to your right, a child giggles, then shushes herself. It's not solemn here, just deeply, deeply respectful. Here's a quirky tidbit for tonight. Some chinampa keepers believe that certain flowers only bloomed under moonlight if sung to correctly. Whether it was science, superstition, or secret gardening genius, the myth persisted. And looking now at those glowing blooms, it's hard to argue. Then it happens. A rustle across the water. You turn your head. The moonflowers on the far chinampa sway. Not in the wind. They move in sync, side to side, as though gently nodding to the song. You blink. Could be your imagination. Could be frogs. Or maybe, just maybe, the old stories had roots too. Historians still debate what these quiet ceremonies were for. Some believe they were about connection to ancestors, who were thought to dwell in the earth, the lake, the mist. Others argue they were rituals of renewal, designed to honor the land for giving, and remind people to tread lightly, even on floating ground. But here, in this place, it feels like something simpler: gratitude. For the maize, for the mud, for the moments where a song makes the lake ripple without touching it. The music fades. The final candle floats gently toward your canoe and bumps against it like a sleepy hello. You whisper a thank you to no one in particular and step back aboard. You paddle away slowly, the sound of your own breath louder than the water beneath you. The light behind you dims. The flowers now still reflect the moon. The ceremony is over, but you feel no sense of ending, only of being folded into something larger. As your canoe rounds the final bend, a faint wind carries the last note of the song back to you. It's soft, but unmistakably there. The lake stretches ahead in silver and shadow as your canoe drifts through wide, glassy channels. The moon is high now, painting the world in the kind of light that makes even mud look mystical. You paddle without urgency, guided by faint torchlights and the occasional flicker of a frog's eye on the water's edge. Up ahead, a glimmer of torchlight illuminates a cluster of canoes tied together, their paddlers whispering behind cupped hands and glancing toward the shore. You've heard this energy before. It's not ceremony, it's suspicion. You turn to look, and there, on the far bank, a group of men in strange armor stand rigid and wide-eyed, staring at the chinampas like children seeing magic for the first time. Their metal glints dully in the moonlight. Their eyes dart between the floating gardens, the flowers, the slow-moving canoes. They are Spaniards. You watch from a distance, unnoticed among the night's shadows and reeds. These conquistadors aren't charging or shouting. They're gawking. One man mutters something in a language you don't know. Another reaches down and pokes the water suspiciously, then recoils, as if expecting it to bite. They speak in hushed, nervous tones, pointing at the garden. One gestures in a way that implies, "This can't be real." Here's your mainstream fact. When Hernán Cortés and his troops first arrived in the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were genuinely stunned by the scale, complexity, and beauty of Tenochtitlan, and especially its floating gardens. Some early chroniclers described them as paradises, cities in the water, or, quite plainly, bewitching. One soldier even wrote that the chinampas seemed to float by magic. From their perspective, it made no sense. A city with no horses, no wheeled carts, no stone plows, and yet somehow functioning better than anything they had seen in Spain. You paddle closer, staying hidden behind a curtain of moonflowers. One Spaniard drops a piece of hard bread into the water and watches it float. Another tries to step onto what he thinks is solid ground, only to sink knee-deep into silt and be yanked back with a hiss from his companion. There's a clear fear in their movements, like they've stumbled into someone else's dream. And maybe they have. Historians still argue whether the Spaniards believed the chinampas were man-made or naturally occurring. Some accounts suggest they thought it was a trick, an illusion orchestrated by sorcery. Others, likely more seasoned, understood the engineering but still didn't grasp the spiritual ecosystem that surrounded it. How could something so muddy be so elegant? You shift your gaze to one of the Spanish scribes feverishly writing by firelight. He sketches a map, but every canal he draws seems to slither wrong. He looks up, confused. One of the gardens has moved slightly in the night breeze. He erases, starts again. The map is already outdated. Here's a quirky tidbit for your pondering. Rumor has it that one of the early conquistadors tried to buy a chinampa from a local farmer using a silver coin. The farmer, unimpressed, offered to trade for chili seeds instead. The deal apparently never went through. You lean back in your canoe and watch as the men retreat slightly, whispering to one another. They've seen the pyramids, they've seen the warriors, but this floating, edible, fragrant world? It's unnerving, and you understand why. Because chinampas aren't just clever. They defy the rules these outsiders brought with them, rules about land, borders, ownership, and control. You think of the moonlit ceremony, the duck-filled canals, the boy who painted dream flowers, the albino maize, and you wonder, how could they possibly explain this to their king? Could they describe a place where food floats, where education smells like crushed petals, and where warfare includes floral fences and strategic duck placement? Probably not. As the Spaniards move away into the darkness, their armor creaking faintly, you breathe easier. For now, the chinampas still belong to those who sing to their squash and stir chili paste with poetry. You paddle once more into the water's embrace, leaving behind the faint noise of foreign confusion. The reeds sway, the frogs resume their chorus, and the chinampas, they float on unbothered. The night is quieter now. No more whispers of invaders, no chants or ceremonies, no feasts or flutes, just the gentle splash of your paddle and the soft swish of reeds brushing against your canoe. It feels like the lake itself is breathing slower, as if winding down after centuries of keeping everything afloat. You've paddled into the more forgotten edges of the chinampa system, places where the plots grow thinner, the plants grow wilder, and the water thickens with lily pads and half-sunken logs. The trees here are older, their branches tangled, reaching across canals like arms trying to remember their shape. You're not lost, but you've definitely left the present. Up ahead, a crooked willow leans over a half-collapsed chinampa, its soil eroded, roots exposed like ribs. The crops are gone. The fencing has crumbled. Only a few marigolds remain, clinging stubbornly to the mud like survivors in a storm. You step onto the edge and find what used to be a house platform, now just a patch of packed earth and moss. A broken pot lies near the center. Inside, there's still a bit of ash, perhaps from a cooking fire, or maybe from an offering no one came back to collect. You sit, and it hits you. This place used to feed a family. Someone built it with their hands, shaped the mud, staked the willows, planted the seeds. Someone once told stories here, cracked jokes, maybe fell in love while harvesting beans. But time, wind, and changing waters have taken their toll. Here's your mainstream fact. After the Spanish conquest, much of the chinampa system began to decline. Some plots were abandoned outright. Others were repurposed for cattle grazing or drained for urban expansion. The lakes themselves, once vast and interconnected, were gradually drained or polluted, especially as colonial priorities shifted away from local knowledge and toward rigid, European-style land use. And yet, not all was lost. As you sit on this ruined chinampa, you notice something curious, a tiny bean sprout poking up through the cracks in the soil. Alone, defiant, you crouch down. Its leaves are small, green, and already leaning toward the moon. Paddle splash behind you. You turn to see a man approaching in a canoe stacked with empty buckets and tools. He's middle-aged, wearing a faded poncho and a headlamp that flickers more than it shines. He pulls up alongside the broken chinampa, nods at you, and begins unloading compost. You blink. He's rebuilding. His name is Benito. He says this plot belonged to his grandfather. It went wild after the 80s, but the soil is still good underneath. He taps it with his foot. Like an old dog, he says. You just have to talk to it a little. You help him unload. He lays reeds to stabilize the edge. You add mud to a low corner. It's messy, ungraceful work, but it feels right. He tells you how he's part of a small collective trying to revive chinampas using traditional methods. Without chemicals, without engines, just canoes, hands, and patience. He gestures around the dark canal. Used to be 20 farmers here. Now, 3. Then he shrugs. 3 is still something. You ask him why he bothered. He doesn't answer right away, just smooths the dirt with the back of his hand. Then, because my daughter thinks tomatoes come from plastic crates, I want her to know about water, about mud, About frogs, here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. In some parts of modern Xochimilco, you can still find Chinampa farmers planting by moon cycles, just as their ancestors did. They time their sowing to coincide with the waning moon, believing it draws water up through the roots and strengthens the stem. Urban planners roll their eyes. The tomatoes, however, don't seem to mind. As you paddle away, you glance back and see Benito humming quietly while planting squash seeds. His headlamp flickers off and he finishes by moonlight. Historians still debate whether the ancient Chinampa model can be replicated in today's climate. But some believe the future of sustainable urban farming might actually lie in its muddy, flower-laced past. You turn a corner, and the broken Chinampa disappears behind the reeds. The city lights of Mexico City begin to flicker faintly on the horizon, but here, in the water's hush, you could be anywhere in time. The frogs croak, the willows sigh, and somewhere behind you, a tiny bean continues to grow. The canal stretches before you one last time, quiet and silvery under a sky thick with stars. You paddle gently, not because you're tired, but because you don't want to leave. The air is cooler now, touched with damp earth, old wood, and the faint floral echo of marigolds. Ahead, you see movement, not rushed or chaotic, but joyful. You drift closer and find yourself approaching Xochimilco, where the Chinampas still survive. Not as they once were, no, but still breathing, still floating, still trying. Bright canoes known as trajineras glide lazily past. Some are decorated with flowers, others with painted arches bearing names like Lupita, Esperanza, and Don Diego. They carry people laughing softly, sipping drinks, and listening to slow guitar melodies that blend with the night air. You find a spot at the edge of the canal and let your canoe bump softly against a willow root. Across the water, a group of young men are stringing lanterns between poles on their Chinampa. They aren't farmers, not today, but they're keeping something alive, ritual through rhythm, preservation through party. A woman in her 60s drifts by in a small canoe filled with flower bundles, simpasicil, dahlias, lilies. She doesn't speak, just smiles. You smile back. Her boat smells like a season. Here's your final mainstream fact. Today, the remaining Chinampas of Xochimilco are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though their survival is precarious. Urban sprawl, water pollution, and neglect threaten their future. But grassroots groups, eco-cooperatives, and indigenous farmers continue to restore them, replanting, reteaching, reviving. You step out of the canoe and onto one of the still-living plots. It's modest, some beans, a few squash vines, a crate of hand tools, but you feel the hum. The same hum you felt a dozen scenes ago in the deeper canals, in the moonlit rituals, in the school beneath the willow. You kneel, press your palm to the soil, and it presses back, not physically but with memory. Thousands of years of cultivation, of ceremonies, of whispered songs and duck footprints. It's all there, right beneath your hand. A boy nearby is feeding ducks. He hums something you almost recognize, something you heard back in the ritual space, or maybe during the floating school's chant. It loops gently. You hum along. He doesn't mind. Here's a quirky final tidbit. Some Xochimilco farmers today still talk to their crops, not just out of tradition, but because it's believed that the plants remember voices, that kindness lingers in the leaves, that corn grows sweeter when raised on laughter. You sit cross-legged as boats pass in the distance, trailing strings of fairy lights and slow guitar strums. One plays an old ballad. The chorus drifts across the water and settles into the vines like a lullaby. Historians still argue whether the Chinampas were the pinnacle of indigenous engineering or just one beautiful system among many. But no one argues this. They worked. They still do. You look down at your fingers, mud-streaked, flower-stained, tomato-scented. You exhale and the lake exhales with you. This isn't just about farming. It's about a way of living in rhythm with water, in step with the stars, and in full, messy partnership with frogs. You lie back on the mat and stare up at the night sky. The stars don't seem so far away now, not when they reflect in the canal just beneath you. You're floating between heaven and earth, between the old gods and tomorrow's gardeners. Your canoe waits, but for now you stay, still, listening, rooted. Wind down begins. The sounds grow softer. The guitar strums fade behind drifting leaves. The laughter recedes into the distance. The water around you is still again, flat as obsidian, with only a few rings where a frog has kissed the surface. The air wraps around you like a blanket, cool, still, full of memory. You lie back fully now, your body heavy, safe and warm. You feel the mat beneath you, the wood of the platform under that, and beneath that, the water, the mud, the roots. A whole invisible city holding you. Above you, the stars keep watch. They shimmer, not brightly, but gently. Like they know you're watching. Like they know it's time to sleep. Let your breath slow. Let your hands relax. Let your thoughts unspool like floating vines in moonlit canals. You've wandered through centuries, glided past gods, planted squash with ghosts, and eaten divine corn tamales by lantern light. Now, there is nothing more to do. The garden doesn't need tending. The ducks are asleep. The frogs are quiet. And the chinampas, they float on. Forever if you let them. Sweet dreams.